All right, our next speaker today is a best-selling author, award-winning scientifically trained UFO researcher and lecturer. Her educational background is in the social sciences. She has lectured nationally, internationally, and is a frequent guest on radio shows. Her expert testimony has been heard on the History Channel, H2, Discovery, National Geographic, and Destination America channels, as well as several news segments and on several documentaries. She's associated with the Mutual UFO Network and is the Director of Experiencer Research and also associated with the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial Encounters and is on the board of directors of that organization and also consults on their research subcommittees. Now, one of her biggest claim to fame for us here is, if you remember in my introduction, I said that we're going to have several of the major cases that set the groundwork for ufology that will be part of what is going on. Well, our next speaker is the niece of Betty and Barney Hill. So Betty and Barney Hill was literally the first abduction case that was really thoroughly investigated. It was one of those cornerstone cases. So there's few people on the planet that know more about that. Obviously, having personal contact with Betty and Barney Hill through her whole life. She has co-written some books with Stanton Friedman. One is called Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. Another one is Science Was Wrong, Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers, and the Alien Abduction Files with Denise Stoner. She has expanded her work to include investigations of contact of non-human entities and the history of government involvement in the cover-up of this subject. So we have some extra little nostalgic things that we're going to sprinkle in here, one of which is some more little video cameo
Good morning.
Introductions.
It's such an honor and a privilege to be with you this morning to discuss with you the Betty and Barney Hill UFO abduction and to set the record straight, to separate fact from fiction in their case. And there is a lot of fiction that has been disseminated in the mainstream media. And we'll get to that in a few minutes, but first I wanted to tell you a little bit about my relationship with my Aunt Betty.
Okay. So please join me in welcoming Kathleen Marden.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much. And I want to say thank you to all of you for coming today. It's such a pleasure to be back at the Ozark Mountain UFO Conference. This is the third time that I have spoken here, and it's one of my favorite conferences. Everybody is so friendly, and it's just such a nice venue to be in. It's a beautiful area, so I really appreciate coming back. And I know if you're from elsewhere, as I am, I live in Florida, that you'll really appreciate it too. It's great. So today I'm going to be talking about some information that is in my new book with Stanton Friedman, Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. And I'm also going to be giving you information that's not in the book, quite a lot that's not in the book. So I want to move ahead. Most of the information that is in our new book cannot be found in other books, nor can it be found online. Stan and I have done a lot of archival research. He's been doing it a lot longer than I have, about 50 years. I've been doing it for probably about 20 years. And the picture that you see of the two of us is at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I went there on 3 different multi-day trips, and I came home with more than 1,000 pages of archival documents that I either photocopied or photographed. Those documents were of such interest to me initially because Philip Klass gave my Aunt Betty Hill such a hard time. and I wanted to know what it was about him, what motivated him to disseminate the disinformation that he did about so many of the highly credible cases, and why he wanted to destroy not only the story, but the people themselves. And I found a lot of information there. Not only did I find that, but I found that Edward Condon's correspondence files are there, Dr. Edward Condon from the Condon Committee. Also, Dr. Donald Menzel. Donald Menzel taught at Harvard. He was an astrophysicist, but I had no idea that he was sort of an insider. He worked on contracts for the federal government. He made a lot of trips to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He was very closely connected, and very closely connected with Edward Condon. In fact, they were fishing buddies. That was really an eye-opener to me. There was correspondence between Philip Klass and Robert Lowe, and I could see how much Philip Klass influenced the Condon Committee's work, especially Robert Lowe and Edward Condon. So that was very, very eye-opening. When I went, Stanton said to me, well, I want photocopies of the correspondence files with Philip Klass. He had written to Philip, they've had correspondence for a good 20 to 30 years, probably closer to 30, but there was not one Stanton Friedman file at the American Philosophical Society. Very interesting. There was a Linda Moulton Howe correspondence file. There was a Dr. Bruce Maccabee correspondence files with many of the leading researchers, but nothing on Stanton except for a page here and there. And what I found was that Philip Klass stacked the deck against Stanton to make Stanton look like a charlatan. Made me very, very angry to see that, because Stanton was the valedictorian of his high school class. He has bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Chicago. He worked in private industry for 14 years as a rocket scientist. And here we have evidence, supposed evidence, at the American Philosophical Society with some of the greatest minds in this country of Stanton looking like a charlatan, which is not right at all. So that sort of set the tone for me for the work that I wanted to do. And Stanton did go with me on this trip, and he asked the archivists if he could give them his own file. So I'm hoping that that is going to happen. To date, as far as I know, it has not. But he certainly deserves the opportunity to put his files there. And I wondered why Philip Klass had a file there at all, because he had a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. He worked as an electrical engineer for 10 years, and then he took a job with Aviation Weekly in Washington, D.C. as a writer, and was one of the editors for that magazine. And so what was he doing there with a bachelor's degree among all of these people who had doctorates? Well, he ended up having a close relationship with Donald Menzel, too, and Stanton found out that Dr. Donald Menzel had a close association with the NSA. He had worked for the NSA. He stated in his personal files at Harvard that Stanton went to, he had to have 3 sets of permission in order to view the files. And what he found is conclusive evidence that Menzel worked for the National Security Agency. So, and Donald Menzel was on the board of directors of the American Philosophical Society. So that's why I think Philip Klass's nasty information is there. So what I'm going to do in this lecture is I'm going to kind of skim over some of the information from the early years, but I'm going to give you information that you don't know. It's not in any books. You haven't heard it anywhere else. You can't find some of this on the internet, but what I'm going to show you, a lot of it, you can find, but I'm going to give you the inside story. So let's begin with Kenneth Arnold. There was military interest in UFOs before that with the Foo Fighters during World War II, and also with the ghost rockets in Sweden and Scandinavia after World War II. Not only were there ghost rockets, but there were actual landings seen by credible individuals in that time frame. But in the United States, Kenneth Arnold had his sighting on June 24th, 1947. He was a businessman, he was a private pilot, and he was out in the Cascade Mountains looking for a downed C-47 transport plane when he saw these 9 crescent-shaped discs. So that was the beginning of the story. There were also separate people who were on the ground who said that they saw these as well. It made national news. It was a big story. But what happened was that it caused a little bit of problems with the public. There was a little public hysteria. There was a prominent minister who told his congregation that this was a sign that the world was coming to an end. There was some panic. People were considering selling off everything they owned. And so the military was concerned about this. They wanted to alleviate some of the fear that the public had. So 6 days later, General Roger Ramey, who was the commander of the 8th Air Force, and his intelligence officer had a press conference. And they told the public at that point, don't worry, it was nothing, no extraterrestrial craft. It was only weather phenomena. And then, of course, I know you all know about Roswell and how on July 8th, 1947, in the paper, there was the announcement that the Roswell Army Air Force captured a flying saucer on a ranch in the Roswell region, near Roswell. And then that made national news. It appeared in many newspapers. There was a little public hysteria, and then the story was squelched. Roger Ramey again emptied the story with a weather balloon. But the Army Air Force was so interested in all of this. This is before we had our regular branch of the Air Force that we have now. They were so interested, but that some of their top-level people did a study. It was the Air Materiel Command Opinion Concerning Flying Discs. And Colonel John Alexander talks about this today. I've lectured with him twice recently, and he stands up and he says, the Army told the public in 1947 that UFOs were real. And this is, well, it was actually secret at that time, but this is what they found. Quote, flying discs are real and not visionary or fictitious, approximating the size of man-made aircraft, extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, metallic or light reflecting, circular, flat on the bottom, domed on the top. And I know that's an authentic document because you can find it in the Condon report on page 894. Project Sign followed that. I'm sure you've heard of Project Sign too, but you might not know that 243 cases that could affect national security were evaluated And in the end, it favored an extraterrestrial hypothesis. Many of these cases affected national security. Many of them were reported by pilots working for the Army. But some of the generals at the Pentagon did not like the results of that report. This had an extensive committee studying all of these cases. So what they did is, in 1949, they closed it down and they replaced it with Project Grudge. And that's sort of, you can tell by the name of that, what their attitude was. They laid everybody off, reassigned them. They kept only 2 lower-ranking military officers, and their job was to explain away all of those cases that that panel of experts could not explain. And so they were supposed to use just some logical reasoning to assign simple explanations to them. And if they couldn't find a simple explanation, there were some psychologists who were working that they could consult with for a psychological explanation. It was a cover-up and a sham. By 1952, Project Blue Book had started with Captain Edward Ruppelt, and he had a serious interest in UFOs and in getting to the bottom of this. So by that time, the ATIC had collected 4,400 UFO reports. 1,593 of those had been investigated. And they attempted to assign them to different prosaic explanations: balloons, aircraft, astronomical bodies, hoaxes, insufficient data, others. But still, at the end, nearly 27% defied explanation. They could not explain them as anything else. He did a very, very good job at the job that he did, in my opinion. But starting in 1951, there was a problem with the CIA. I call it a problem. They were very concerned about all of this, and they wanted to learn all that they could. Well, in May of 1952, Donald Menzel held a meeting at the Pentagon with 6 military officers. Dr. Donald Menzel walked into that office and he said, "I have a solution to your UFO problem. I've done a few elementary experiments using liquids of different densities, and I can explain all of this away." And the Air Force officers said, "What makes you think that a few of your elementary experiments explain anything?" Well, he didn't like that. He wanted cooperation from the Air Force. He then said, "Well, I would like to volunteer for Project Blue Book. I'll work on it as a volunteer and help you to dismiss all of these cases." And so they said, "No, we have the people we want on Project Blue Book." But later on, by the 60s, you'll find he was working as a volunteer on Project Blue Book. He also said, "Well, cases, hoaxes make up a lot of these cases." And the Air Force said, "No, only 2% according to our statistics." And then he said, "Well, I've written 2 debunking articles, one for Look and one for Time, and I want your endorsement on these." And then General Garland said to him, "We refuse to blindly endorse your few simple theories." And he stormed out of the room at that point. He was very angry. Then we had, of course, the UFOs over Washington, D.C. in July of 1952. And that spring, UFOs were seen up and down the coast. There were a lot of very good close sightings. UFO sightings across the United States and as far away as Japan. There was a lot of public interest in the topic at that point. And then we had these extraordinary radar visual sightings in Washington, D.C. Military pilots scrambled these UFOs. The pilots had visual contact with these UFOs. People on the ground saw them, and highly experienced radar operators also saw these on the radar screens. Now, there were temperature inversions almost every night that summer. But in the end, what the FAA tried to say is that they were only temperature inversions. These were spurious targets on the radar screen. Don't worry, folks, it was really nothing. These radar operators didn't know what they were doing. They were highly experienced. They didn't want to mention that people on the ground and that military pilots made visual contact with this craft. So they said the top scientists had been called in to launch a major investigation. The major investigation really didn't produce any positive results. All it was is spurious targets on the radar screen. A couple of days later, General John Alexander Samford called a press conference at the Pentagon. It was the largest press conference since World War II. And what he told the public in part, and I'm going to quote this, so I'm going to read it, reports like this go back to biblical times. And now this is not a quote, but it's in the report. He said, "We have an interest in this. We're concerned, but we're not overly concerned. We are studying it." He said, quote, "We're not trying to discredit the observers. That's the reason that I said we have many reports from credible observers of incredible things. There is nothing else in the work that can do these things except phenomena." And I want to place the emphasis on phenomena because he's talking about things that are observable in the sky, but are not necessarily things that can be studied scientifically. And you're going to see that word appear time and time again. Not flying discs, not structured discs, but let's call it phenomena. The CIA was more involved in the study of this. They had the Robertson panel on February 14 through the 18, 1953. It was headed by Dr. H.P. Robertson, who was the chief science consultant to the CIA, and 4 very prominent physicists who were all politically connected. And that is the clue. They looked at some Air Force files, not enough, and the ones that they evaluated were not evaluated properly by them. Let me give you an example. There was a Navy officer who was traveling with his family, his wife and 2 children, and they were traveling from one base to another. He was being reassigned, and they were going through Tremonton, Utah, when his wife sighted something that was very, very interesting in the sky. And he looked up, and it was so interesting to him that he stopped the car. He got out, and he looked at these things. They were light reflecting. There were many of them. He could tell they were not birds. And he decided, since he was a photographer for the Navy and flew on planes as a photographer, many years of experience in doing this, that he would videotape these. Well, he took the video. He sent the video to Wright-Patterson. The Air Force did an extensive analysis on these frames. They spent over 1,000 hours analyzing these frames, and they said they could not be birds in flight. They appeared to be metallic and light reflecting. They then went to the Navy, and the Navy came up with the same report. But these scientists at the Robertson panel saw his film and then was shown a film of seagulls in flight. And one of these scientists said, "Look like the seagulls I see off the coast of California." And so what did the committee do? They said, "Send it back to the Air Force and the Navy for reevaluation. They're wrong." Also present were the leaders of the CIA's project team from the Office of Scientific Intelligence. And then these representatives from the Air Force were waiting out in the hall. They were not permitted to go in initially. Edward Ruppelt, who I introduced, Alan Hynek, and Dewey Fournet. So they were waiting outside, and they could hear the scientists at the beginning scoffing and laughing about the job that they were going to do, and how H.P. Robertson had to take control of the group and say, "This is supposed to be a serious study." They were not happy, these Air Force officers were not, and Alan Hynek were not happy about what they heard, and they were not happy about the final result. Here are some of the panel recommendations. Panel members stressed the opinion that UFOs should be viewed as phenomena, much as Foo Fighters during World War II. They recommended a debunking campaign that would reduce the public's interest in flying saucers through television, motion pictures, and popular articles. The scientists were encouraged to debunk UFOs through deductive reasoning, and they encouraged surveillance of civilian UFO groups and their leaders. And some of those UFO groups and their leaders have reported that they had been spoken to by the Air Force and given guidance on the information they should tell the public. Donald Kehoe did a radio show early on, I believe it was in the 1950s, and he was carefully scripted about what he could say. And he went a little bit off script, and they turned off that television show. You couldn't see the rest of it. There was a huge public outcry over that. But it was very, very carefully monitored. So there was a new approach to UFOs. No longer did we have Edward Ruppelt's careful, serious study of UFOs. The Air Force instituted Regulation 200-2, and that said that Project Blue Book will inform the news media on UFOs only when they have been positively identified as familiar objects. The names of the principals, intercept and investigation procedures, and classified radar data will not be revealed. All unsolved cases are classified. So let's not show the public what we really have. Then, JADAP 146, the Joint Army-Navy Air Force Regulation, was initially written in 1948. But it was not institutionalized until 1954. And that said, it is a crime for military personnel to discuss classified UFO reports with unauthorized persons. Violators faced up to 2 years in prison and $10,000 in fines. Project Blue Book Special Report number 14 was in the works way back in 1952. It was the largest study on UFOs ever done by the federal government, funded by the Air Force, and done at the very prestigious Battelle Memorial Institute. In the end, 21.5% of these cases were true unknowns, and they did an extensive study on this. They spoke to many of these reporters, and still 21.5%, a little bit lower than Edward Ruppelt's study in 1952, but still not the 3 to 5% you hear about today. To this, the Secretary of the Air Force, Donald QUARLES, made the statement, quote, "On the basis of this study, we believe that no objects, such as those popularly described as flying saucers, have overflown the United States. I feel certain that even the unknown 3% could be explained as conventional phenomena or illusions if more informational data had been obtained." Well, the illusion was that it was 21.5%, not the 3% that he told the American public. And I think that really needs to be stressed. We don't have 3% in MUFON either. It's more like 20%. Over and over again, the statistics are higher. It's not that 3 to 5% that the debunkers would like you to think. This is some information that occurred in that general time frame that I think is very interesting, because it's been something that really has not been told to the American public before. I have the file on this, and it took place in southern Maine. Admiral Herbert Knowles lived there with his wife, Helen. And at that time, there was a woman named Frances Swan, who was a neighbor of theirs just down the street. And she started to have contact with a couple of extraterrestrials, she said. It was in an unconventional way. One was named Panar, and one was named Alpha. And she said that they were traveling in these huge, huge ships that contained motherships and smaller craft, and that they were in the outer atmosphere circling around the Earth, and that they were here to help humans. They were very concerned about nuclear weapons. They were concerned about what we were doing to our planet. I found a letter in my Aunt Betty Hill's file, and this is Betty up here. And what I found is that Admiral Knowles became so interested in Frances Swan's information that he took her letter to Eisenhower, he took it to the head of the Navy, he took it to the Air Force. There was a lot of interest in this case, and what you can see here is a letter that was written by Helen Knowles to my Aunt Betty. And I'm going to read part of that to you about her memory of what had occurred. She said, "Herbie not only helped her out," meaning Frances Swan, "but personally endorsed her letter after he read it. Then, because its contents were of vital national importance, he addressed a personal letter to Washington, which brought a group of departmental top brass to our home. Much correspondence ensued, and when they learned that the information described in her letter was not orthodox or obtained by conventional means, they withdrew their interest and they went home." And she added, "And I was getting tired of making sandwiches for that crowd during that time." There was interest at the FBI, and this is one of the pages that actually Grant Cameron found and sent to my Aunt Betty. And so I found it in my Aunt Betty's files. And it said that it was a matter for the Office of Naval Intelligence. Said Knowles and others had buzzing sounds in their ears before receiving messages, just like Frances Swan did. So they had tried it too, and they received messages. from these alleged aliens who are up in these huge motherships. The report said the above information is being made available to the Office of Special Investigations at the U.S. Air Force. This is Wilbert Smith. He was very interested in this as well. He was working with Admiral Knowles. He was the director of Project Magnet for the Canadian government and Project Second Story. He was a senior radio engineer for the Transport Canada's Broadcast and Measurements section. So you might have heard his name before. It's quite prominent. Now this is a letter, I'm going to read part of it to you, and it was a letter written by Admiral Knowles to Wilbert Smith. And the way I obtained this letter is that I tracked down Admiral Knowles' daughter, and she gave me the family files to photocopy. So I have a nice folder of information, but this I found particularly interesting. This is a letter written on December 3rd, 1956, and it says, "Flying saucers are real and come from outer space. The real important thing to know about them is why they are here. Their source of mechanics are merely incidental. 3, their people have contacted people all over the earth in various ways, trying to get to us a common message about coming events. No one nation, people, or area is being shown preference by them, and none will be. Any technical knowledge gained from them will be so incomplete that no nation can take advantage of it to the detriment of other nations. Absolute neutrality is requisite in all their contacts with us. Beware of all reports that show preference or partiality on their part." Close quote. I thought that was very, very interesting. I have some of the letters that Francis Swan wrote, and these are some of the additional messages that came from AFA. You must stop polluting the earth. Humans must become more spiritual and raise their vibrational frequency or level. How often do you hear that today? The same message is being given to us today that was given to us back in the 1950s. And are we listening? I hope that people in this audience are, but the general public is not. And that is very, very worrisome. They will provide competent teachers to educate us all. There is a displaced magnetic field problem on the earth caused by nuclear explosions. All vibration is sound. Sound waves permeate the universe and affect the human body. Become peaceful, and your sound will create peace. And I think that's a very important message. It's one that I think we should all heed, because they are here to help us. They don't want to see us destroy this planet, and they're very fearful that we are on that path. So let's move ahead to the 1960s with increasing distortion and derision. These quotes come from Colonel Hector Quintanilha's personal, unpublished autobiography. He was the head of Project Blue Book from 1963 until 1969, when it closed in December and January of 1970. But Donald Menzel, who had offered to be a volunteer consultant to Project Blue Book way back in the 50s, was now working at Project Blue Book as a volunteer consultant. And this is what Hector Quintanilla wrote in his autobiography. He said, "Dr. Donald Menzel has helped with some very ticklish cases, I consider Menzel to be a true scientist and not a publicity-grubbing charlatan. He also gave Philip Klass a compliment. Klass didn't come on the scene until 1966, but this is what he had to say about him, quote, "Philip Klass has offered a number of UFO cases that turned out to be beauties. I consider Klass to be an excellent investigator," which he was not. He was an excellent debunker. He was an excellent propagandist, but he did not do a thorough investigation on a lot of these cases that he debunked. On others, he did do a pretty thorough investigation and was able to dig up dirt on people that had been expunged from records. Well, Donald Menzel and Philip Klass used speculation and disinformation under the guise of science to debunk every prominent case. For the Travis Walton case, he said it was a hoax. For the Betty and Barney Hill case, boy, they had a lot of explanations. Donald Menzel said that it was a misperception on their part. Philip Klass had all sorts of explanations for them, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later, toward the end of this presentation. They said that Betty Cash and Vicki Landrum, famous case down in Texas where they were both burned, Betty Cash very, very seriously by a UFO, and ended up never being able to work again. What they said about her was that she laid a template down on her skin and burned herself intentionally for the publicity she would get, that she was just a big attention seeker. Philip Klass, during that investigation, did everything he could to disrupt that investigation. He wanted to be in there in the middle of it. Unfortunately, he harmed many people. And then we move on to the scientific study of UFOs, Dr. Edward Condon and Robert Lowe. Well, Condon had quite an outstanding career as a physicist. He worked on the top secret S1 committee at the National Bureau of Standards. He worked at Los Alamos under Oppenheimer as deputy director on a phase of the Manhattan Project. And he worked to develop the radiation laboratory at MIT, the lab where America's radar development began. He also worked in private industry. The problem that he had is that he wasn't able to keep his security clearance because he couldn't understand why the military, in developing technology scientifically, had to compartmentalize everything. He thought if there was more openness, that it would progress at a much faster rate. And his security clearance was pulled. And when he went into this project, he did not have that security clearance. But for some reason, Robert Lowe had a top secret security clearance, even though he was just the project coordinator of the Condon Committee and former director of the Center for Atmospheric Research. Guess who worked there? Who spent a lot of time out there? Dr. Donald Menzel. Here again we see a connection where all of these people knew each other. He was a graduate school dean at the University of Colorado at that time, and he and Philip Klass became very close friends, and Philip Klass was able to influence the direction that the project went in. It's all, in fact, fiction and flying saucers. I found an interesting quote in my aunt's files, which I have a copy of all of her archival records, and I also set up an archival collection at the University of New Hampshire. So if you're ever up in New Hampshire, the archival collection is at UNH. You can go there and see all of that. Her dress is there. And you can go up to Lincoln, New Hampshire, and you will see a monument. It's a historical marker that the state of New Hampshire erected to commemorate my aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill's experience. So I'm very proud of asking the state to do this, and finally, after several years of waiting and submitting information and submitting texts, and I had to give them, I think it was 25 references proving everything that I said, that they finally erected that historical marker. But what I found in my aunt's file was a letter from Dr. Berthold SCHWARZ, and he was a prominent psychiatrist who had an interest in UFOs and an interest in the paranormal. He and my Aunt Betty became close friends, and they corresponded with each other for many years. He always gave her birthday presents and Christmas presents. She'd go down to visit Bert and his wife, so they had a close relationship. And he wrote about Ivan Sanderson, who was a very prominent paranormal researcher. He said, Ivan Sanderson also knew Condon, and the story was, as you know, that he was asked to do a job or take the consequences of being investigated for his past. Whatever the motivation, he undoubtedly did a good job for his unseen masters, close quote. Well, you probably all heard about the trick memo, so I'm not going to go into that, but David Saunders, Dr. David Saunders, was the co-principal investigator on this, and he and Dr. Norman Levine found the trick memo in the files at the University of Colorado. They handed it to Dr. James McDonald. It went to NICAP. It went to John Fuller, who wrote Incident at Exeter and The Interrupted Journey. And John Fuller published this article in Look magazine, The Extraordinary Story of the $500,000 Trick to Make Americans Believe the Condon Committee Was Conducting an Objective Investigation. He titled it Flying Saucer Fiasco. Caused a lot of problems for these men and for Condon himself. They were dismissed from their jobs. He was thinking about charging them with insubordination for releasing this information because all of this was supposed to be quiet. The public wasn't supposed to know that the intention was already there in the beginning. Many people say that it wasn't. If you read Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers and other articles that I've written about it, I believe it was an intention from the beginning. And there's some good information in the Condon report. If you get and you read the meat of that report, there are some excellent cases, but that is not what Dr. Edward Condon took to the National Academy of Sciences, of which he was a member. And this is just one quote that I thought was simply extraordinary. He said and wrote, "It is safe to assume that no intelligent life outside our solar system has any possibility of visiting Earth anytime in the next 10,000 years." Where did that figure come from? It must have been based upon a mathematical model, but we all know that that simply is not true. Well, General Carroll Bolender, after that, talked about two separate communication channels. He wrote, "Reports of UFOs which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP 146 or Air Force Regulation 55-11 and are not part of the Blue Book system. As previously noted, reports that can affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures designed for that purpose." So very similar to what I read to you from way back in 1953 and 1954, when those regulations were put into effect. Well, as I told you earlier, Philip Klass not only attempted to destroy the individuals who had contact, who had close encounters, but also scientists who were involved in this, who had credibility. So let's take a look at some of the things that he did. And I found this in his file at the APS. He had disseminated disinformation to Jack Anderson at the Washington Post about James McDonald's activities. Dr. James McDonald is probably the most famous and best scientist who ever investigated this topic. He was the chairman of the physics department at the University of Arizona. He ended up becoming the co-chairman because he took such an interest in studying UFOs. So he was co-chairman when this occurred. He had funding from the Office of Naval Research to do cloud studies in Australia. So when he went to Australia to do these cloud studies, he spent his spare time when he wasn't working at his job interviewing people who had UFO experiences in Australia. So what Philip KLASS told Jack Anderson is that he had evidence that James McDonald was using Office of Naval Research funding inappropriately, that he was using it to fund his trip to Australia to interview people who had observed UFOs. It was a lie, and James McDonald was exonerated in the end. The only problem was that Philip KLASS got his way, because Dr. McDonald never got another penny from the Office of Naval Research. In another letter, I meant to add it, I don't have the quote here, but it was a letter from Philip KLASS to Dr. Edward Condon, and this was when James McDonald attempted suicide the first time. Now, there were more reasons than just what KLASS was doing to him and what Ed Condon was doing to him. He had marital problems as well. He was being laughed at by his peers. He'd lost his funding from the Office of Naval Research thanks to Philip KLASS. But Philip KLASS wrote to Edward Condon, I had written to you before that I predicted that Jim McDonald would be on a psychiatrist's couch pretty soon. So I hold KLASS responsible for a lot of the problems that Jim McDonald had, and I think it's a real tragedy. He also attempted to destroy Allen Hynek. This was in 1975. Hynek was teaching at Northwestern at that time. He was the director of the observatory there. And he had written an article for the FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin. And in that article, he discussed some of the popular misconceptions that the public has about UFOs. Well, where did those popular misconceptions come from? It was information that was being disseminated by Philip KLASS. So Philip KLASS was furious. He called up the FBI and he wrote letters to the FBI. And this is what the FBI wrote, quote, in strong terms laced with sarcasm, he said that Hynek is the spiritual leader of a vocal group of believers and kooks who claim we are being visited by extraterrestrial spaceships. The FBI has given its endorsement to a hoax that UFOs are of extraterrestrial origin and to a fraud, Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Well, what did the FBI do? And I'm very proud of the FBI for this. They wrote, quote, KLASS was informed that Hynek is a highly respected scientist, recognized by all creditable professionals in his field of expertise, who is affiliated with a leading university. And KLASS responded, he won't be for long. Class had a little spy at Northwestern who was taking astronomy courses there and reporting back to Class on anything that Class might use to attempt to destroy Hynek. The FBI also wrote, Class's attempts to discredit Hynek are totally without foundation. Hynek could scarcely have any better scientific credentials. All of his writings and public statements that were examined prior to his publication disclose a meticulously objective and scientific view of the UFO phenomenon, close quote. We didn't know what he'd done to Stanton Friedman until Rich Dolan made a research trip up to Ottawa, and he was looking through archival records there. Class had warned the Hertzberg Institute of Astrophysics National Research Council that there was a pariah coming to Canada. He said Stanton Friedman and his second wife were moving from California to Canada, and he made many disparaging remarks about Stanton. He said, oh, Stan couldn't make enough money down in the United States, so he was looking for new ground where he could make more money. The real reason was that Stan's wife was from New Brunswick, Canada. All of her brothers and sisters were there, nieces and nephews. Stan and Marilyn's children could get to meet and play with their cousins. The family could be together. That was the reason, but that's not what Philip Klass said. He called Stanton a noted ufologist and full-time lecturer of the snake oil salesman variety. He said his lectures are filled with half-truths and falsehoods. Very long letter here, but it really slandered Stanton, and it could have been used if the word got out to prevent Stanton from ever finding a good job in Canada, where he did work for the CBC at one time, and he did continue his work part-time as a physicist while he was also working as a UFO lecturer and researcher. So now I want to get into Project Blue Book's deception on my aunt and uncle Betty and Barney Hill's case. I think that I've placed most of my emphasis in former lectures on my relationship with Betty and Barney and from my perspective, what happened. But I want to show you the documented evidence of what they told the Air Force, Project Blue Book, immediately after their experience, and how Project Blue Book changed that information. Well, they said that it was a continuous band of lights they saw for 30 to 60 minutes. They said when it swooped down and was above them, it was as large as a dinner plate at arm's length. Remember that an aspirin at arm's length covers the full moon. So this was huge when it swooped down, and it went even lower. In the report it says it followed an erratic flight path. It ascended and descended swiftly several times and flew in a jerky motion. You can see the sketch that Barney drew on September 20th, 1961, when he returned home. You can see the craft and you can see the figures in the craft. He wrote on the top one, this is how it looked when it was about 200 feet high. And he pointed to the red light on each side. And then he said, this is how it looked, I can use this, after shifting over the field, over the highway, and descending to about 100 feet over the field. So these red lights extended out on fin-like structures. I found other early cases that reported the same thing. They said in their original report, and this is their original report, part of it right here, It stopped and hovered in the air. There was no sound evident. When the object was above them, after it had swooped down, they heard a series of short, loud buzzes, which they described as sounding like a dropped tuning fork. They state they could feel these buzzing sounds in their auto, close quote. They said, when they arrived in the vicinity of Ashland, New Hampshire, they again heard the buzzing sound of the object. However, they did not see it at this time. Mr. Hill stated, inasmuch as he and his wife did in fact see this occurrence, he decided to report it. And I'm not going to go into great detail about their case right now and what happened, but that craft did move back over the car after Barney ran from the field screaming to Betty that they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured. He got into the car, he's speeding down the highway. He said to Betty, roll down the window and look up, see if you can see it. She did roll down the window, she looked up, she expected to see the lights, and all she saw was blackness. There was a full moon, almost a full moon that night. It was about 3/4 full. There were stars out that night, but all Betty saw was blackness. And after that, within moments, as they're speeding down the highway, she and Barney heard these buzzing sounds that appeared to be code-like, striking the trunk of their vehicle. And when they arrived home, they found shiny spots on the trunk of the vehicle that had not been there the day before. When they placed a compass over it, the needle would spin and spin, indicating that there were counter-rotating magnetic fields. And we have found that in other cases as well. It does not pertain only to Betty and Barney, I'm happy to say. Well, I found some contradictions in the Air Force's files. Betty and Barney said the vehicle ascended and descended rapidly. It swooped down, but somehow Project Blue Book revised their statement, so you have both statements in the report. They said there was no lateral or vertical movement noted, even though in Betty's letter she showed the UFO descending vertically, traveling horizontally, ascending vertically, traveling horizontally, descending again. They said there was no evidence presented to indicate the object was due to other than natural causes. I'd like to know what natural cause takes up the whole windshield of that car, because when that was hovering above their vehicle, Betty and Barney said that it filled up the whole space of that windshield. What other natural cause causes that code-like buzzing sound to strike the trunk of their vehicle and to leave counter-magnetic rotating fields on the trunk of that car in those shiny spots? They said, the Air Force file, it was probably an advertising searchlight. An advertising searchlight in a desolate area during the off-season in upstate New Hampshire? And then they decided to revise it. They said, oh, it's the planet Jupiter. Don't worry about it. They said it was the result of a strong temperature inversion. Well, I knew they were lying about other things, so I decided that I would do some research to see if it was the result of a temperature inversion. I got in touch with a senior meteorologist I knew, and he got in touch with 2 other senior meteorologists that he had worked with for many years. They went to the National Weather Service Bureau. They looked at the archival records for that night, and this is a quote that they sent to me, quote, "The light east airflow that night would have caused subsidence warming, just the opposite of an inversion as claimed by the Air Force." So here we have, at the start of this report, evidence that the Air Force was lying, that they were covering it up. This, I want to read to you just a short quote from my Aunt Betty Hill's letter to Donald Kehoe at the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Because when she arrived home, she was so interested in what this was that she went to the Portsmouth Public Library, she took out a book, and she read that book. It was the first book she had ever read on the topic of UFOs. The address for NICAP was in the book, and it asked anyone who had a UFO sighting to write to NICAP. So Betty did, and this is what she said. As it approached our car, we stopped again. As it hovered in the air in front of us, it appeared to be pancake in shape, ringed with windows in the front through which we could see bright blue-white lights. Suddenly, 2 red lights appeared on each side. By this time, my husband was standing in the road, watching closely. He saw wings protrude on each side, and red lights were on the wingtips. She went on to say, as it glided closer, he was able to see inside this object, but not too closely. He did see many figures scurrying about, as though they were making some type of hurried preparation. One figure was observing us from the windows. From the distance this was seen, the figures appeared to be about the size of a pencil and seemed to be dressed in some kind of shiny black uniform. She said, at this point, my husband became shocked and got back in the car in a hysterical condition, laughing and repeating that they were going to capture us. He started driving the car. The car motor had been left running. As we started to move, we heard several buzzing or beeping sounds, which seemed to be striking the trunk of the car. Not long after that, Walter Webb from NICAP came and interviewed Betty and Barney separately and together for a period of 8 hours. He was a scientist. He was an astronomer at the Hayden Planetarium in Boston. And this is just a significant part of his report. And this was a confidential report, but it's no longer confidential, obviously. All of this information was released in 1965 as the result of a violation of confidentiality. But he wrote, the approaching UFO finally filled up the entire field of the binoculars. The leader at the window held a special attraction for the witness and frightened him terribly. The witness said he could almost feel this figure's intense concentration to do something, to carry out a plan. Mr. Hill believed that he was going to be captured like, quote, a bug in a net. That is when he knew it was no conventional aircraft he was observing, but something alien and unearthly, containing beings of a superior type, beings that were somehow not human. Well, it's very interesting to me as I was doing my research that I found a report titled, Should the U.S. Air Force Reopen Project Blue Book? It was done by 2 Air Force officers at Maxwell Air Force Base in 1974. And one of the statements they made in that report was, during the final years of Project Blue Book, it was not unusual to find 3 or 4 explanations for the same UFO sighting, with no reason given for determining the final selection, close quote. They said the Air Force's official explanation on the Hill case turned out to be, quote, almost as erratic as the radar and visual sightings themselves, close quote. They said, quote, Project Blue Book ended their investigation of the Betty and Barney Hill sighting and the corresponding radar sightings without ever recontacting the Hills. This is a particularly disturbing aspect of this sighting, close quote. Another statement by them, quote, the official Air Force release concludes by stating that no evidence was presented to indicate the object was due to other than natural causes, but makes no mention of the radar tracking, close quote. And again, quote, the radar shimmering originally reported to the press in the Herald Traveler, that was the violation of confidentiality, where a newspaper reporter from Boston, Massachusetts, wrote about the Hill story for 5 days in a row. But he said, was much more than a shimmer indicating an air mass. It was a bona fide sighting. It is not clear why Project Blue Book purposely withheld the information to the press regarding the Pease Air Force Base radar sighting. And there were 2 radar sightings that night, not just at Pease, but also at the North Concord, Vermont radar station. They wrote, no attempt was made to visit the reported UFO landing site, close quote. No attempt was made at, quote, drawing a possible correlation between the visual radar UFO reports, even though former Project Blue Book director, Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, admitted as early as January 24, 1953, that visual reports that supposedly correlate with erratic radar tracks warrant a detailed investigation. They said Blue Book assigned, quote, zero priority, quote, close quote, to the Hill case, but demonstrated a significant interest in the case after it was publicized in the popular media. And this is just one page from the article written by John Luttrell for the Boston Traveler. They sent the Hills file containing 2 articles from Look magazine by John Fuller and articles from the Boston Traveler by Luttrell to the Pentagon, indicating quite a serious interest in the Hill case. So after that, we have Donald Menzel again, who came in to discredit the case, and Philip Klass, who worked for many, many years to discredit this case. Some of the civilian disinformation that began after that was introduced by Klass and then built upon by other civilian debunkers and disinformants. One of them was that Betty was intensely interested in UFOs. She was not until after her sighting. She'd never read a book on the topic. Another was that Betty was a lifelong UFO fanatic. False. Philip Klass always called Betty a lovable kook or just plain kook. It's been said that she was delusional. It's been said that all the details that Betty remembered were found in Barney's account. That is absolutely false, and I have demonstrated that in our book, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, where I've lined up quotes, and I also downstairs have 2 CDs left, DVDs left, of their hypnosis tapes, where I've lined Betty's statements up against Barney's statements so you can hear that for yourself. They said that Barney was a weak, fearful man who would believe anything and say anything that Betty told him. That is also false. Some people said it was a hoax, and Donald Menzel always used the explanation that it was just a perceptual problem. Betty and Barney thought they had this close-up encounter. They thought they heard these buzzing sounds. Barney thought that he saw these non-humans on the craft, but he was just mistaken. Faulty perception. This is evidence of who Barney actually was. Valerie Cunningham, an African-American historian from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, who knew Barney, said, quote, Barney was fearless and outspoken. Barney was appointed to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. This is the letter of his appointment, dated May 21st, 1965. He worked on the State of New Hampshire Advisory Committee. Betty and Barney were politically active in the state of New Hampshire. We were invited to Lyndon Johnson's inauguration because I campaigned right along with them, and the 3 of us went. And here you can see a commendation that Barney received. It says, Mr. Barney Hill, NAACP Director and Executive Board member of the Rockingham County Community Action Program, was awarded the Certificate of Commendation by Governor John W. King and Sergeant Shriver Charles F. Whitmore, UNH Economic Opportunity Director, for his work through the Office of Economic Opportunity for the good things he and Betty did for the citizens of the state of New Hampshire. That is who Betty and Barney really were. Not a couple of kooks, not a couple of weak people. So, are we any closer to disclosure? There's been a lot of talk about disclosure recently. I've been hearing that talk for the past 30 years. It hasn't happened yet. We know that there's a cover-up. In our book, Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers, Stan and I wrote about some of these things. Well, for one, the military-industrial industry profits from wars. Concerns over the impact of religious groups. I talked earlier about the consequences of the minister who took to his congregation the news that the earth was going to come to an end after the original sightings took place. I've received many, many letters. In fact, one Christian scholar wrote a 50-page paper about my book with Denise Stoner, The Alien Abduction Files, quoting from the Bible, that all of this was demonic and that we're actually talking to demons. I think that in some cases, from the paranormal evidence I've seen and the religious evidence, that yes, there are some demons, but that's not what Betty and Barney experienced. That's not what most people experience. Most people are having contact with aliens from another planet who have come to this earth, or maybe from another dimension as well. It could cause disruption to our society. Then there's the abduction problem. Some people are having negative abductions. The military can't protect them. That could present a problem. And no one nation speaks for the world. So how will the world, since we're all engaged in warfare with one another, get together and cooperate on this? So that's the end, and it looks like it's 3 o'clock, so I'm going to get us back on schedule. I started a little bit late, but let's get on schedule. Thank you.